Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Believe me, to find the right speaker on the material culture of New Nederland, Dutch North America, most universities and museums would flounder or give up at that. But not Yale, because that speaker is right across the street from the gallery in the History of Art department, Professor Edward Cooke. Actually, he might just as often be found in the American galleries here or in the Furniture Study Building around the corner with students of American decorative arts, teaching with the real thing as the prime material. Ned Cooke is the Charles F. Montgomery Professor of American Decorative Arts. His chair, as most of you know, is named for a pioneer scholar curator in the field who was one of Ned's teachers at Yale, and the creator of the program at Winter Tour in Delaware, which Montgomery described as an active research and teaching program using the museum as a laboratory for the study of American decorative arts, life, and living during the early and formative years of our country. Well, that was a mission that drew Ned from Yale to Winter Tour to take a master's degree and then on to Boston University for the PhD. He stayed at BU for 7 years. During some of that time, he was also curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. In 1992, he returned to Yale, where he's served not one but 2 terms as chairman of the History of Art department, a total of 10 years of involuntary or voluntary servitude. Lucky man. Lucky department. His books and articles have covered applied arts of all kinds, furniture, folk art, crafts, architecture, interior decoration of early America, as well as modern furniture and crafts. He knows materials from the inside out. Wood, for example, the techniques of joining, of turning, carving, and finishing it, as well as the market mechanisms that put its products into the owner's hands. Outside the classroom, he's organized at least 6 museum exhibitions. He was the founding editor of the Journal of Modern Craft. For 25 years, he's been the director and the main motivator of the Yale Center for American Art and Material Culture, which is a cross-disciplinary group of faculty, students, and museum people who meet pretty much every week at lunch to hear a paper and discuss it. In his own teaching here, he's been an innovator. Recently, he's been giving an undergraduate course of his own invention on global decorative arts, concentrating on certain forms and materials that are common to many cultures, such as ceramics, textiles, metals, furniture, and glass. So given all this, it's no surprise that he's had an interest in the North American colonies before they became British, when they were Dutch, part of the vast expansion in the 17th century of overseas trading posts of the Dutch Republic across most of the globe. Today, his topic is the domestic material world of the New Netherlands. I'm proud to introduce Ned Cooke.
I want to give you room. Thank you very much, John. Hopefully people can hear me in the back row. Let me just get out of this. There we go. So I'm pleased that John had asked me, even though it's a daunting task to bat 6th and last in the order of events on New Netherlands and, well, Netherlands material culture and art. But I became very interested in contributing to this because I feel like so much of the attention about the Dutch expansion has been primarily through the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. And so people automatically think about the route through Cape Town, through Ceylon, to Malacca, to Batavia, and thinking about that whole relationship to Chinese porcelain, Chinese silks, picking up some ivories from Ceylon or along the west coast of Africa. But today what I want to do is talk about the Dutch expansion, which I think is actually a term that oftentimes people use about the Portuguese expansion in the 16th century. And since the Dutch basically build their whole idea off of what the Portuguese expansion was about mapping the world, about exploring the world, and about taking advantage of those kinds of commercial networks, that it's appropriate to thinking about the Dutch expansion in the New World. And it's surprisingly broader than one thinks, because it encompasses areas like Brazil, Suriname, Curacao, as well as the kinds of areas that I'd like to focus in on today. And it's a lasting kind of presence in spite of the fact that, as I'll talk about, the Dutch sort of tread lightly on the land as they came here to the New World. And you know, the Dutch first engaged with the northern part of the Americas, starting with Henry Hudson's voyages in 1609. They establish a charter with the West India Company, which is the equivalent, the WIC is the equivalent of the VOC in the East, for the rights to Hudson's territory, the famous sort of bargaining for the island of Manhattan that people talk about. And I think it's important right from the start to realize what's going on, what's the pulling force of Dutch interest in North America. And it's not necessarily a settler colonialism, which is really in essence what the English kind of project is all about, which is come in, obliterate the landscape, the native peoples, and plant, and have central chimneys, this whole notion about the contrast between New England and New Netherlands is really quite striking. You could contrast the Dutch emphasis on navigation and exchange rather than a form of settler colonialism. You might think about the emphasis on sort of loosely formed towns, gathering posts for the gathering of objects versus towns with churches, with homes that are firmly rooted on that kind of cleared land. We might think about an emphasis almost on fluidity, on change, and sort of nimbleness in some respects, rather than permanence, which is all about New England, is about permanence on the landscape. We might think about commercial exchange, about negotiation as being much more important than agriculture and this idea of cultivation of the land. In short, what I think you need to have a mindset of, and I think that really sort of characterizes the Dutch impact on North America, is to think about it as Donna Merwick, the historian of Albany, talked about. They navigated the land. Think about what that means. You navigate the land rather than you settle it. And if you navigate something, you tread lightly, you sort of pass over it, you pass through it rather than stay put on it. So the upper reaches of the Hudson Valley, which showing the famous Dankert's map here, to think about what the Hudson Valley really represented, the opportunities with its many, not just the Hudson River providing a central artery into that area, but also the numbers of streams that go west, and what that did in terms of providing furs for the fur trade, going back and then being turned into hats and fashionable items back in Europe. So New Amsterdam, that is what is now New York, that is Manhattan, becomes the real center for Dutch commercial entrance, not necessarily a booming port in and of its own right, like Boston or Salem or places like that at this point, but rather sort of a settling point from which you could then go upstream. And I think that the details on the Dankert's map and some of these other sorts of maps from the mid-17th century really highlight both what's inland, which is the native population gathered in their longhouses that you see on the right, the 6 nations in upstate New York, who become partners. Not necessarily, they are not pushed to the inland, but actually the Dutch enter into partnerships with them. The Dutch are never a dominant population at this time. So if you see these maps and the fact that they always are representing bears, beavers, all the different kinds of animals that you could trap, as well as the Iroquois and Six Nations kinds of living quarters, and then you contrast that with what you'd see in New York, sort of, this is the tip of Manhattan. Battery Park is right over here. It's kind of run down. It's not really a significant kind of, that Russell Shorto would have you think of this as the island at the center of the world. It's not the island at the center of the world at this point. It's really people existing just on the edge of civilization, because this isn't their main sort of concern. The West India Company, by the late 1620s and the 1630s, they realized they're losing money. This is not a going concern. This is not the commercial kind of opportunity that they'd expected. So they take on this novel idea of developing manors. And what they do is they start to auction off different land grants to members of their corporation, because the West India Company is a corporation. You become a member, purchase a membership in it. And they establish these large patents, these patroonships along the Hudson Valley to any company members who can settle 50 families there in that particular land. Then the land becomes theirs. And these manor lords would pay for the transportation and the setup costs for these people coming to the New World. And the renters would then take the profits from any improvements that they could take on. So this sort of system, if you look at this map here, you start to see all these land grants and names that become quite familiar to you, like Van Cortlandt, like Rensselaer, which was the largest sort of patroonship, was Killian van Rensselaer. These are the sorts of people who start to say, okay, we've got this land, and they take a very strategic kind of attitude towards it. What they do, you'll see by sort of looming in the horizon here is Connecticut, Massachusetts, the New Englanders who are taking over the land, who are marching inland and also westward. What these manor lords oftentimes do is they take the land on the west side of the river and they put the renters on the east side, which is actually the better land for agriculture, but ultimately it becomes a buffer to New England. And the manor lords, why would you take the west side? You think automatically, oh, it's not as good agricultural land. Actually, it's got the, more of the streams for water power for mills, which is where the money can be made for processing agricultural goods. It also gives them further land to go westward. So if you think of that trade-off, and also access to furs as long as the fur trade continues. So the manor lords cut this good deal. They get the west side, they get sort of the potential for greater profits without having to work as hard as the renters on the east side. The point from, really this point, 1629, is when the patroonships are set up. Until about 1650 is a time of real turbulence in the New Netherlands. People are setting up along the Hudson River. You are being subjected to the ups and downs of the fashion for fur in Europe. And in fact, by the 1640s, there seems to be some sort of down dip in the fur trade that sort of forces people to turn inward and say, okay, now what do we do in some respects? And they turn to Western Long Island, for instance, to become the breadbasket for the city. This is a familiar pattern with this dense settlement at the tip of Manhattan. And you start to see ways in which Manhattan, that is New York, really starts to emerge as a little bit more of a settled town, a little bit more than the ramshackle kind of town you saw in the Dankert's map. And certainly, if you look at this map, this is Wall Street right here, aptly named because that's the northern edge of New Amsterdam at this point. You've got a fort because they felt like at this point, you needed some sort of protection from those greedy New Englanders who were trying to grab a lot of land, including taking Hartford from the Dutch in the 1650s. But you'll also look at how people have reconstructed what this tip down by the wharf really looks like at this point, and immediately start to see ways in which it becomes a very familiar landscape of Amsterdam, of Haarlem, of sort of canal front, waterfront property, in which, again, sort of water as a means of transportation, of communication, in which you have houses that are gable end to the street. In other words, they're narrow in width, but they stretch back. And this is sort of the very typical kind of Dutch architecture that gets transformed here to the New World. And you find in 1660, there are approximately, in all of New Netherlands, that is the Hudson Valley, as well as Manhattan, there are about 5,000 people living there. 5,000 people, that's about, 2/3 of the population of Boston at the same time. It's about 1/7 of the total population of New England. It gives you a sense of, and actually this is actually an improvement. For a while there in the 1620s, there were maybe 500, 600 people of Dutch extraction living in the New World. And it's not simply Dutch. This is the other thing that's so fascinating. It's what I would call a non-Anglo Northern European population, predominantly Dutch, but also Flemish, Walloon, German, Scandinavian. It's sort of this potpourri of people from Northern Europe who are coming to the New World. And I mention this just because I think it's important to start to realize we use the term Dutch as shorthand for what's going on here. And it's the dominant culture in many ways. And it's this sort of dominance that I want to talk about. And in fact, from the period of about 1650 on into the early 18th century, you can talk about a flourishing of Dutch culture, even if England takes over, politically takes over New York in 1664, then gives it up briefly, takes it back in 16, so there's back and forth. But it definitely is part of the English empire. In fact, for a while there, New York was lumped in as part of the Dominion of New England with the dreaded Sir Edmund Andros based up in Boston, sort of ruling that kind of province of that was the 6 New England states plus New York at that point. But you can start to see, as I suggest, sort of with this view from the Costello Plan of 1670, the ways in which New Netherlands, New Amsterdam really has some similarities to the Netherlands. And so I wanted to talk about architecture and then start to move to the inside of the houses. And one of the ways in which you can start to see that Dutch architecture in the New World is so different than New England architecture. Showing you on the right both a isometric drawing as well as a of the Gedney House up in Salem, Massachusetts, as well as a reconstruction of the Fairbanks House that was set up, which was a 1637 house in Dedham, Massachusetts, to show you that what the English form of framing, post-medieval framing, might be considered a hierarchical kind of framing. That is, they're timbers of many different sizes, the largest being the so-called summer beams, these carrying beams that sort of tie together different parts. They can be as big as 20 inches in dimension. Heavy, heavy things. These are the things I hit my head on when I walk through 17th century houses. Then you might have the next largest would be the sills. Next largest after that would be the vertical posts. Then the plates that rest on top of them. You might have principal rafters, secondary rafters, purlins, and then the kinds of what we would think of as joists running in between. There are probably 7 or 8 at least different dimension timbers that go into this kind of over-engineered kind of housing. What it does is also allows to have a large central chimney that carries right through the hole all the way down into the basement. It's continuous. You all know it in terms of these central chimney 17th century houses. So think about hierarchical framing, thinking about the ways in which you oftentimes have a house that could be 1 or even 2 rooms deep, and also 2 rooms wide with a large central chimney, and then start to think differently about a Dutch framing system. And one of the primary differences is something called the anchor bend or H-bent system. And what you do is you have posts that run up vertically and then are tied together by a horizontal beam. But these posts continue past the carrying beam up like a half a story into the second story, and then have the roof rafters over that. What this does is it creates an organic system that you could add on to, add additional H-bents. So you have one room in one dimension, in this case, the width, but you could keep going further and further back. And it's this framing system that's unlike anything you see in New England at this point, but it's very much tied into a Dutch tradition. How does this play out in terms of some of the housing in New York? The earliest houses, and again, these are relatively small houses at this point. They might be 3 rooms deep or 2 rooms deep. They would typically have an entrance hall, a front room, which is the more formal room called the Grootkamer, and then a back room, which is oftentimes the kitchen, eating, what you might call the back room of everyday life in some respects. And you can see within these houses that initially get built in New York at this point, you start to see this very H-bent system in which you've got these very strong horizontal pieces, the H pieces, oftentimes with heavy brackets holding them up. And they oftentimes occur at relatively close spacings, say 2 feet, one after the other. So you have this kind of rhythm that goes down these organic houses. There are several other features in addition to sort of having an entry hall, and the H frame actually also allows you to continue a rafter out and make a side aisle if you wanted to also have a separate entrance and create a larger Grootkamer in the main room. These are some of the leading merchants in New York who are building these houses. So think of it for a second that you've got 2 rooms on the first floor. You've got these very steep stairs up to basically an attic storage area that is sort of, for me, it'd be like living in the garret. I would not be able to stand up except in the center part. But by and large, what you've got is constricted space, oftentimes not really fleshed out at this point. And it becomes the urban house type that you see throughout the New York, Hudson Valley sort of area. So Albany, Schenectady, these are the areas that you start to see these sorts of houses. And you can really identify them, again, gable end to the street. This has got the stepped gable that you saw as well in Netherlands itself. But notice where the windows are in the second floor and where the plates are for the roof line. They're about halfway up that window. And that's because the H-frame is right down in through here, and that vertical post is continuing past that. And it gives you that very particular look that you see in a lot of Dutch housing that you're not aware of initially, but then the more you see these sorts of things and contrast that to a full-fledged 2-story kind of house, or just a 1-story house with a gable roof, you start to pick up these sorts of distinctions. You'll also see the fact that this is a storage area oftentimes for merchant goods down below, that these houses tend to be above grade slightly. So you've got a decent basement below them. You've got storage oftentimes up in the attic and having these central sort of storage doors and oftentimes cranes that come out from them. It's about commerce, it's about trade, it's about storing of goods that you could, here's the little storage door that you could hoist things up right from the street, keep them up in that top floor, in essence, that 3rd floor. You'll also see that it's got a different kind of fireplace, where the fireplace in New England is a really broad and it's continuous all the way down. Oftentimes you'll find the chimneys to be something called a jambless fireplace. That is, the hood over the fire is cantilevered out, and that the actual stack doesn't really begin until right about below the H-bent frame, and really exists only sort of in a smaller form up through the center part of that roof. And it becomes one of these real characteristics of this sort of housing. Just to go through again sort of the lasting kind of image, now that you're tuned in to what these houses really look like, again, look where the windows are in relationship to the plates of the rafters, and the fact that you've got those second floor that is extending up, and imagine where that cross piece is for the H-bent framing. Look for the storage door in the upper part of the facade. And how this really continued on in terms of, it's not as if people turn the page from Dutchness at a certain point, but these sorts of houses continued on for much of even into the 19th century. This is examples both from New York, the three larger pieces here, as well as a recollection from Albany that shows the continuation in which some of these Dutch stepped gable front to the street sorts of houses continued even as these later sort of mid-18th century or late 18th century Georgian symmetrical, door in the middle, evenly balanced out fenestration on either side, even though those houses were built up and around the Dutch versions, that the Dutch housing continued to be visible, to be sought after, and studied in some ways into the 19th century. You also find that in the countryside, as people started, the manors started to be established, that certain people were also moving not simply from that gable-ended sort of structure, which sort of served the purpose at first, but twisted it 90 degrees and started to develop these more typical rural sorts of houses, which were long in width, only one room deep, but oftentimes had entry doors for both rooms on that first floor. And we tend to think of these as small, but actually they're built out of brick, they're built out of stone. Kilian van Rensselaer, the wealthiest manor lord that we had talked about, the person who had the most land, who built the greatest fortune at this point, didn't build a new house until 1765. So he lived in basically this two-room sort of house on the west side of the river, which gives you some sort of sense of if the upper crust, as it were, is living like this. Scale is something that we're not accustomed to thinking about. And if you look at a house like this, it would be probably about a third to a half the size of a standard sort of colonial Connecticut, Massachusetts house at the same time. And the ways in which this sort of connected into the agricultural prosperity of this area. Here's another one of these houses that, it's got the two rooms here. It's got one door entering in and then another door entering into a kitchen. But you can again see that there's a small chimney for each of the rooms, so that would have the jambless fireplaces. But it's all part of this larger complex, and just as a foreshadowing, take a look at the size of the barn, that the barn actually is bigger than the house. And if you think anything about the alluvial soils in the Hudson Valley and the fact that it's ideal for agriculture, especially on the east side, grain cultivation, wheat, was very strong in this region at this time. And just again, the Van Allen House, which is open as a historic site, and really what you're looking at is, this is a later addition from this wall on down to this side. So that's a slightly later addition. This is the main house, including here with a jambless fireplace. You start to see the way the H-bent, that anchor beam, runs across with the bracket down to the post. This is a well-preserved example, but there are countless other examples that looked you might think as being derelict housing going through different parts of the valley. But this, again, is very typical of that kind of rural housing for successful people who are building in brick and in fieldstone at this time. So back to the interior features that I wanted to talk about, and one of them is this whole notion about the jambless fireplace. What does it look like? And you'll see, for instance, in the Metropolitan's period room that they took from the Wynn House, these are how this close spacing on these tie beams, how close they are really sort of building up the rhythm of these particular houses, and how the chimney is a fairly thin brick construction behind here. It gets a little bit thicker with the flue, but basically this is a large projecting cornice that serves as the hood to gather up the smoke from the fireplace. You'll also notice the use of tin-glazed earthenware tiles up the side as another form of decoration. It's a way in which the interest in tiles in Dutch interiors, not simply along the baseboards that you see in various Dutch painters, but also starting to articulate the sides of a fireplace when you don't have the architectural fabric of pilasters and mantelpieces, et cetera, around it. This gives you, from the way the Schenck House is reinstalled at the Brooklyn Museum, gives you a sense of how far out into the room a jambless fireplace really projects. And you'll start to see the real size of the cornices, the moldings on here, something we'll see in some of the furniture as well. The other aspect of the H-bent framing, the anchor bent framing of Dutch houses that is allowed is this way of having beds built in, the so-called box beds. And you'll see here, and it's rife throughout a lot of the Dutch paintings at this point, is the way in which you've got the built-in wooden box that then is fitted out with fabric for a valance as well as for curtains, that this is a place for sleeping. And in fact, even if you look at some of those earlier mid-17th century plans I showed from New York City, in which they have X'd out areas that oftentimes are defined by the spacing of the anchor bents, that's where they built in the box beds. And how it then becomes prevalent in terms of both, you'll see in the Schenck House from the Brooklyn Museum, here's one of those tie beams. It becomes the front side of the box bed. The next one in provides the other side of it. So they frame them in right around those tie beams. And even sort of the persistence in which that continues on in the mid-18th century, how there might be joiners who provide paneled sorts of box beds. That idea that bedding is not a four-poster, but rather it's this self-contained, it's a mini room, as it were, that provides privacy, maybe a little bit more heat, security, rather than just sort of floating out there in a four-poster bed. I'd mentioned earlier the idea of the Dutch barn. And again, this is the size of barns in New Netherlands dwarfs anything in New England at this point. New England barns are probably, again, half the size. It gives you a sense of where people put some of their resources. And the reason why these are large barns is, again, related to the manor system, the wide acreage that's allotted to the raising of grain, because the size of these barns determines that you've got this large central door that you can drive your wagon filled with grain right in there, and you can thresh it on the floor. There's no wasted energy. You can then store it up above and through here, and you can keep your animals in the side aisles. That's the way the system works, and it starts to become very clear when you strip away all the clapboarding and start to see the ways in which you've got, there's the tie beam again, the way that the posts extend up to support the rafters of the roof. The rafters extend out, provide these aisles for animals on the side. You can drive your wagon, as I said, right in there. It's got high clearance. It's another one of these advantages of the tie beam. And then you store your threshed grain up in the upper level. So this is an efficient kind of machine for large-scale agricultural production, but many of the framing elements still relate to those kinds of structures for the houses. Even the brick houses have wooden framing inside of the brick walls that have this. So what goes on inside the interior of these small houses that I was talking about in New York, even these small houses up along the Hudson Valley? They're manor houses, they're townhouses, but they're really small. But they're rich inside, and it's the sort of thing that you're not expecting. You think, you need a larger kind of area to show off your goods. But in terms of furniture, ceramics, silver, and textiles, there's a real sense that you get of Dutch accomplishment, of material accomplishment and abundance that people are trying to emphasize on the inside. The way to think about it is not so much what's the income so much as how involved you are with trade. This is a way to show your relationship to what's going on back in Netherlands. And it's the same model just as much as in the Netherlands. They are interested, particularly through the VOC, of bringing exotic goods in, but then that becoming the inspiration for local production, which then gets marketed by Dutch trading networks. So it's that sort of import and export that is taking place in the Netherlands at this time. And so what you've got going on here in the New Netherlands is the way in which the house becomes a stage to display and to really honor Dutch trade goods and Dutch products. There's not sort of this idea of long-term permanence per much as objects that oftentimes, other than cost, the kosten that I'll talk about, have sort of this degree of flexibility associated with them. So let's look at a couple of different types of objects that we might associate with the New Netherlands. One is the kast. This is a storage form for clothing, for textiles, things that are crucially important to Dutch living, whether it be table linens, the idea of the linen industry in the Low Countries, whether it be clothing, that this is not stored in chests. This is not stored in chests of drawers, but actually it's put within kasten. And the ways in which these are objects that are very much presented on the interior views of paintings from the Netherlands in the mid-17th century. The fact that somebody who comes to New York City and becomes the mayor brings his own kast from the Netherlands. They do knock down. You can take parts of it and ship it here to the New World, but the fact that it meant that much that he brought that with him says something. But local joiners also made many of these same things. And this sort of is an example from the river valley, from the Hudson River Valley, that gives you a sense of, again, look at the moldings that are very similar to the jambless fireplaces, large projecting moldings far beyond just sort of a simple way. They've got doors that open up to reveal shelves. So you fold all your linens and clothing. You might have a small drawer that's hanging down from one of the interior shelves. You might have a drawer in the base. But this is the basic storage. This is the closet. This is the chest of drawers. This is the bureau of the 17th and early 18th century. And it's not simply Netherlandish examples, but you might find an example like this with paneled oak with inlay with these polygon panels in the upper section that actually relates a lot more to Flemish work at this time. It's not simply only Dutch, and this speaks to my point about people coming from throughout Northern Europe. And the ways in which they then take simple means of sheathing the back. These are just clapboards such as are being used on the sides of houses and filling in the back. So the emphasis here is on the front, on show, on the display that you go into this particular cabinet. There are examples that, again, sort of work off of that oak system. This is more of a Dutch form, but again, having that same sort of clapboarding along the back, in which they're turned vertically. Very elaborate painted in this kind of trompe-l'oeil grisaille, sort of working off of a gray, black, greenish vocabulary that gives you the architectural sense of niches. But also speaking as well, when I look at silver, we'll talk about this whole notion about book arts and engraving being so much a part of the mindset of the Dutch at this point, that these, in some respects, become flat printed examples, even though they're painted, of that kind of illusionistic architectural work of the same time period. And this, just to remind us of not just table linens, but things like bizarre silks, the ways in which people were in Netherlands were importing Chinese silks and then adapting, bringing in raw silk, adapting their looms to a slightly narrower kind of width, and producing the same sort of patterns on silk that becomes the symbol of connection into this larger Dutch world. And you see the kind of bizarre silk. This is well before the banyans of cotton, Indian banyans that are so often featured in the portraits of the mid-18th century. These late 17th century versions are really Dutch versions of Chinese kinds of silk dressing gowns at this point. And you can see the turned up sort of interior as well. These are major display textiles at this point. We could think about sitting, different kinds of seating that are associated with the Dutch that are slightly different than the Anglo versions. If you think about the carving, for instance, in a wainscot chair, it's much deeper than what you'll find on New England equivalents of the same time period. With turned slat-back chairs, the ways in which the rear slats are shaped. The turnings, much more elaborate, oftentimes having kind of barrel-like turnings, even sort of the underarm support that you've got here. There's a richness to the vocabulary for these sorts of turnings that are unlike the kinds that you would find in New England. And certainly the kind of dense packing of different shapes that you see here within the rear posts, within the spindles in the back, speaks to this way in which the turner in the New Netherlands area is producing work that has its own vocabulary, just as much as, again, sort of thinking about these chairs being produced out of cherry, local woods in northern New Jersey, as well as around the New York City area, with this multiple ball turning. These are, in essence, these small back stools. And this is, in essence, to talk about the ways in which upholstered back stools, this is missing its original leather seat, but this is very similar to in size, proportion, even some of the detailing, other than the fact that they've got slats in the back, to a lot of the chairs in Vermeer paintings, other sorts of Dutch interiors. But again, featuring this really wildly turned kinds of front stretchers. And then how even chairs that are imitating imported Boston chairs, these tall leatherback chairs based on the English cane chair, that the New York turners will add additional kinds of vocabularies, will carve the arms that swell down, they slope down towards the handholds that have very elaborate sorts of turnings along the front stretcher. This is all sort of the ways in which the New York woodworkers, the turners, the chair makers, are adapting different parts to this world. One of the most distinctive forms of decoration inside these houses was the spoon rack, something that is made out of yellow poplar that is about 19 inches wide, but speaks both in terms of the carving with this kind of what's called chip carving, very shallow, geometric kind of carving, oftentimes with dates associated with them that seem to be given, have certain gift-giving kinds of markings whether it's weddings, which also goes into the whole way in which silver spoons were often given as funeral presents to those who attend funerals. So spoons and spoon racks become another important way of knitting together these sorts of communities in the Hudson Valley, northern New Jersey, even western Long Island. So it's around the perimeter of the city that you see them. Silver represents another sort of surprising element. If you think about the sizes of these houses, you go through the inventories of New York at this point, and it's striking with the amount of silver that is recorded, that people owned, and the ways in which they are closely connected in with what's going on back in Netherlands. So you can see ways in which a local silversmith, Jacob van der Spiegel, and again, sort of pay attention to the names here, and you'll start to see the ways in which these are people who are of Dutch and or German extraction, who are the makers of many of these pieces. But it's very similar. This is a form you don't find in New England. What it's close to is, say, a piece from Harlem that's owned locally. And there are a number of people who are owning Dutch silver here in the New World. If you look at the first church in Albany, you've got a piece that's made in New York and a piece that's made in Harlem, Netherlands, not Harlem, New York. And this sort of way in which they're closely connected into importation, the makers themselves closely connected, and incredibly sophisticated, again, sort of the print culture, the visual culture that is so prevalent that I talked about within the grisaille cost also can be seen in the engraving, say, on this. This is just rotating this one beaker around by Cornelius van der Berg, in which you start to see the morality emblems taken from a book published in 1655 that are unfolded both within the cartouches along the mid part of it, as well as the symbols of different animals and different kinds of stories that take place along the bottom. And then even along the top in the ways in which oftentimes printers' ornaments, border designs, this is what you see being transcribed, being cut into the silver, much in the same way that the Dutch are navigating on the water through the land. They're actually cutting through the silver here in its silver. The kind of silver that's, the engraving, Boston's got some very elaborate engraved silver at the same time period, but the heraldry tends to be much dense, sort of tighter. It doesn't have the same looseness. It doesn't have the same kind of shadowing and shading that you find within a lot of the New York Dutch-influenced kinds of engraving. And here, you start to see not just simply the coat of arms being an expansive one, but also this use of cut card ornament, something that is sort of die rolled and applied along the bottom. Typical also is these little corkscrew thumb pieces along there. But look at even sort of the engraving all along the edge, the flange of the top. It's that sort of delight in manipulation of the metal, of decorating it in so many different ways. Or another example by Jacob van der Spiegel, and the use of a cipher for marking who owned this particular piece of Hendrik and Winty Meyer, who you can see the intertwined large M, you can see the H, and you can see the W all intersecting in there. This is a point roughly at the same time that the English-trained silversmiths in Boston are simply engraving block letters. It would just be H, W with an M over the top of it. Serif letters, but they wouldn't have this kind of elaboration of ciphers. They wouldn't have all the kind of ornament that's decorating a tankard like this particular example. Or thinking about two-handled cups, something that could be as simple as a small little brandy taster, heavily chased, that is sort of not engraved, but actually hammered in with chasing tools to create sort of the low relief kind of texture. or someone like Gerard Onkelbag with this kind of paneled kind of chasing, or Onkelbags that are producing this larger two-handled covered cup in which you've got repoussé chasing, you've got engraving, finding what is not manipulated in terms of the surface is a small part of this particular piece. But that notion about engraving, about the kind of visual delight, is not simply painted on Costin, it's not simply engraved or repoussé chased into silver, but you even find imported pewter that has inscriptions and decoration in it, far in excess of anything you'd see in the Anglo world. And in fact, there's inscription in German here that talks about the plate being given from a mother to a daughter, and sort of on, this idea that this is a maternal kind of gift obligation. Even objects that are produced in the Netherlands and are shipped here, traded with the Six Nations in northern New York, have stamped kinds of decoration in it. These are not simply plain objects. This is the articulated surface that is so key to a Dutch mentality at this time. Finally, even sort of thinking about glass and the ways in which Dutch glass industry started to develop their own response to the Murano elaborate glasswork. And you'll see some still lifes that have elaborate Venetian glass, but then also you'll start to see local glass. That's a piece of Venetian glass that's tipped over in the background. But here's a piece of Dutch glass, and this is, you find all sorts of shards, pieces of this kind of glass in archaeological sites here in the New World. And again, sort of that point about articulated silver seen here in the Taza that's lying down, or this value of pewter that you see in the pewter plates. These are things that are transferred here to the New World. But I think it's ceramics that I find most interesting in terms of sort of articulating this difference from New England and Anglo world, and thinking about ways in which, we certainly know it from a lot of the Dutch paintings, particularly around the maidservants of earthenware. It's a world of ceramics. And in England and in New England, oftentimes when you think about the fireplace, you think about the world of iron, cast iron. You think about iron and bronze and brass pots, and this is where I'm talking about the idea of permanence. And within the Dutch kind of fireplace, what you find is the world of ceramics. Ceramics are oftentimes used for a wide variety of cooking and food preparation. You see it within some of the interiors, but then you start to see it as well within the kind of objects that turn up archaeologically in Albany, in the New York area. And what I'm struck by here is that utilitarian earthenware, the kinds of things that are used for colanders, for rinsing out vegetables or for making of cheese, of skillets, of pipkins that are used for cooking. These are all sort of lead-glazed earthenware, and oftentimes earthenware like that is local. The kind of clays everywhere, it's low firing, everybody can produce their own and oftentimes do, or they rely on some indigenous ceramic production, which was also taking place here along the Six Nations area. But rather than having local ceramics, local earthenwares in New Netherlands, what they did was they continued to rely on imported Dutch wares. Why would you do that? It's that sense that you could have it locally made, the same way you have Costin made, but this actually sort of is this sort of habit that continues on, that they continue to look to the use of Dutch ceramics as something that is important. And they think of the multicolored glazes, whether they be yellow, green, orange. There are red glazes. There's something about the fact that the Dutch are exporting, that they're involved in these kinds of exchange networks, that they continue to favor that and never develop a local earthenware industry in the New York area. It's not until the independence in the late 18th century that you start to see the stoneware industry develop in New York, but the earthenware industry does not exist. And even sort of in the 17th and early 18th century, you continue to have the stoneware being imported like everybody else. You're importing it from the Westerwald area around Cologne. And this becomes the common form of storage, heavy-duty sorts of wares. And I think this, again, sort of where these are found from Seneca Iroquois sites also speaks to the relationships with the native population that these trappers would oftentimes come to Albany and would trade furs for these sorts of goods, but they were getting some of the best goods that were being imported from Europe at this point. Not very different than just sort of going for glass beads or what people tend to think about for the exchange of Manhattan Island. But it's really in tin-glazed earthenware that we start, that whole notion that we now tend to refer to as Delft, that I think you start to also see this fascination with Dutch ceramics and the kinds of sherds, that is, pieces of tin-glazed earthenware that are found on the archaeological sites in parts of New Netherlands. I think that really starts to showcase how clued in these colonists are. And you can see both the reliance on the Chinese porcelain, the so-called crockware, with this kind of panels around the rim, with Wan Li sorts of decoration. You see the acknowledgement of maiolica from Italy, oftentimes seen within that very geometric kinds of decoration. But then there's some really specific Dutch motifs as well, like the tulip that they're importing from the Ottoman Empire, and how they put that into their own vocabulary. And I think that these are all Dutch-produced kinds of tin-glazed earthenware, but they reflect the ways in which the Dutch commercial ties are bringing goods in from Italy, from the Ottoman Empire, from China, and they become sort of ingredients for the Dutch stew, as it were, that then gets transported, transshipped out to the New World. One of the things that's really quite striking about one body of this work, I use the term tin-glazed earthenware, in which you've got the white tin oxide along the front, such as you see here, but then you look on the back, and they've just got ordinary lead glaze. So it's that very sort of, again, it's that kind of facade that we saw on some of the Costin as well. Where you put your main effort is on the front, on what is most visible. And many of these also have holes that are drilled into the feet, into the rim, before they're actually glazed. So those are original holes that you can see the glaze going in, which meant that they wanted to provide hanging mechanism if you wanted to loop some wire through there, and you could hang it as a form of interior decoration. These are not, I oftentimes refer to these plates as being used in the vertical mode rather than the horizontal mode. But there's also another kind of tin-glazed earthenware in which they don't sort of make it cheaper by putting lead glaze on the back, because tin oxide is more expensive than the lead glaze. But there's a faience in which you've got complete, this is tin glaze on the front as well as on the back. These are fully tin-glazed sorts of cups, and they're chocolate cups. It's a very specific kind of cup. But these are found, again, in the Seneca Iroquois sorts of village sites. These are objects that are being traded with the Native American fur trappers and people who are collaborating in some respects with the Dutch population. Well, this whole notion about Dutchness, and you can see so much of it is this story from 1670 on into the 1720s. It starts to fracture in one way right at the end of the 1740s, and you can start to see people like the Van Cortlands, Frederick Van Cortland, who, the English have been in power for more than a generation now. There are new sorts of alliances that are taking place, and they start to build and live in a very different way. So they start to construct Georgian larger houses that have 4 rooms that are all symmetrical. They bring in immigrant London carvers like Henry Hardcastle to do a very elaborate Palladian kind of interior. You find that someone like Philip van Rensselaer decides to buy up-to-date Anglo furniture that's in the latest sort of Chippendale style that you see here. Even somebody like Peter Van Dyke, who trains with Bartholomew Leroux, who's one of the great Huguenot silversmiths in New York, working very much in that kind of broader Northern European tradition, he adjusts his work, so he's also producing tea caddy that's very much like what's being produced in London in the late 1720s. Very similar to something that James Logan in Philadelphia, for instance, purchases at that time. So here's a way in which you can talk about Anglicization taking place in terms of taste, in terms of buying patterns, of shifting to that kind of English world. But it's not complete. It's not totally dominant. That you find traces of this kind of Dutch culture that continue right on through the 18th century, whether it be out on Long Island, where you find a Quaker family buying a Dutch cast, which is in the Yale collection, quite a bit later than one might expect from some of this other work that I've shown, or up in Greenwich, Connecticut, of all places, 1780 to 1800, a Costin form that's being built that's a little bit more sort of joinerly, making a little bit more use of sort of a chest sort of sense in the lower section, but is that kind of lingering formal quality that you see. Up the Hudson Valley, you find, again, sort of house joiners producing very simple sort of Costin over the end of the mid parts of the 18th century. You find people like Cornelius Kierstetter, a silversmith who started off in New York City. I showed one of his tankards. He moves to New Haven. And what does he do for a gift to one of the tutors from the students? This is the days when students used to bestow their professors with nice gifts, hint, hint. But for Thomas Darling, who's one of the tutors at Yale, he produces a bowl that, in some ways, it's right from the 1690s in terms of paneled, chased kinds of decoration. Up in Albany, Jake Ten Eyck produces another bowl that's a two-handled bowl. So at least it's kept that notion about a brandy bowl. But it's a lot later. It's a generation later. One could even say that the Kierstetter piece is almost like a punch bowl. It's sort of like a small punch bowl, but still it sort of speaks to this notion about formal continuity and preservation. But there's also some places that it's a little subtler kinds of continuity. There are a series of chairs that are found along coastal Connecticut, along Milford and Stratford, that have pierced heart cutouts, what are called heart and crown chairs, that have these molded balusters in the back. But you can also find the molded balusters upstate around Kinderhook, around Albany. And these are areas that you see some of these continued joiners. The Durand family were descended from Huguenots from southwest France, who were part of that movement into New York at this time. Did they bring this sort of quite complex turning vocabulary and these banisters as part of that tradition and continued to make these chairs right through into the 1750s? One could also talk about a type of chair that the Durands and others are making that is referred to as a York chair that sort of now looks a little bit more fashionable with this splat that's very much sort of what we would call in the Queen Anne style, but all of which have these turned legs that are simulating the cabriolet of a joiner, but done by turners. And again, you've got the Durand family producing their version. You've got another French Huguenot family in New York, the Coutang family producing those chairs. And then you've got similar chairs being made in the Hudson Valley. So it's this broader kind of world that continues on 100 years in some of these different parts of sort of a Dutch cultural hearth. We could even think about something that's even subtler, that's sort of less conscious, not just formal vocabulary, but we might think about the ways in which those jambless fireplace cornices, the cornices of the Costin, have, I talked about them being very wide, and oftentimes they're a single board that's had these moldings cut into them, and then you back them with a triangular piece of scrap wood to be able to sort of fill it in. And it creates this very distinctive, it takes a little extra time to cut a triangular piece of scrap wood to be filler in there to give you the jambless fireplace or the cornice on a Costin. But isn't it interesting how you can go to Woodbury, Connecticut, and you can see a shop producing these chests that what they do is they run the moldings in the same way. It's one continuous piece, as you see here, with triangular scrap wood in between, which is very different than the usual Anglo technique, which is to take two pieces of the same wood, run the moldings on one piece, run another set of moldings on the other piece, and tack them together. So it's a different, rather than having a triangular piece, you've got a series of rectangular pieces that have moldings cut on them. This is the kind of subconscious. This is the sort of thing that actually, the more you look, the more you find this evidence of Dutchness. It's not simply formal continuity. It's not simply certain decorative devices, but it's even this kind of way of conceiving the guts of a piece of furniture that really speaks to that kind of length. So I wanted to just leave you, after sort of running through all these different ways of thinking about the Dutch New Netherlands world, is a couple things just as a reminder, what I hope you've gotten from today. One is that the idea of the Netherlands as a commercial network more than as a political empire, because it's really, they're not really governing here. And in fact, that's one of the real problems in New York, is that it's a bunch of people who continue to try to take over. It's a corporate business, corporate world. It's the same way that one might talk about the British East India Company running India up until the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857, is the ways in which the commercial businesses really ran it. And you can see it how people actually move in the VOC and the WIC. That the Bard Graduate Center did a wonderful show a number of years ago about the inventory of Margaretha von Werk, who was in Malacca, who was in Flatbush. There are people who, like people in the British East India Company, who move through different stations, who might move from Batavia to New Amsterdam and then back to Amsterdam. And to thinking about that kind of mobility of how those people move and accumulate sorts of objects along the time. So there's a real fluidity amongst these operatives, these merchants in New York. Second, I wanted to remind you that Dutch is not a pure Dutch, but it's this northern, what I said, this non-Anglo Northern European, that the Huguenots, that the Walloons, the Scandinavians are also playing a role within this. Third, the fact that Dutch taste, formal and decorative, continues well into the early 18th century. And then finally, fourth, is this kind of way in which the subconscious elements linger, they persist. And it's oftentimes in areas along the periphery of what we might think of as the center of the Dutch New World. And that is the Hudson Valley, northern New Jersey, but also Long Island Sound, and how actually New Haven, Greenwich, Milford, Stratford, parts of Long Island are just as much an important part of this story as Manhattan itself. So rather than saying the island at the center of the world, maybe we should think about valleys and sounds as being the center of the Dutch world. Thank you very much. If you still have energy, I'd be happy to answer any questions that people might have. Yeah. The legs attached? The skirts are just tenon in.
Oh, sorry. On the chests, how are the legs attached? Because they have so much weight placed on them.
It's actually a whole frame they're set on. So the legs, the four legs, actually have frame members that are tenoned into them. and then there are blocks that actually, the whole carcass sits into a frame. There's a question back there. Liz?
You spoke about the Hudson River Valley, but was there any influence at all shown? Is this on?
It's on.
Yes, thank you. In the Connecticut River Valley.
Connecticut River Valley has a minimal amount of connection. I know of one piece of furniture actually here in the Yale collection that has a history of ownership in Middletown that actually is a Dutch Kosten, smaller version. It's one of the few things, and obviously, the Dutch are up in Hartford as a trading post until the settlements of 1660 and 1650, when they start to divide up the territory where the Connecticut border with New York is really set at that point. But that's one of the few things that I know of that you can really speak to that. But the more you look at maybe some of the subconscious parts, we might find more.
Thank you.
Hi. In addition to the cornice structure on the Kosten, are there any other characteristic Dutch joinery aspects that differ in the 17th, early 18th century than what the English were doing? Like I've read mitered joints versus butted joints on case furniture.
I haven't seen mitered joints, but there is one thing that I've seen, and that is the use of wooden pins for substitution for nails in drawer bottoms that I've seen in a number of pieces sort of along the Housatonic Valley and then also across the Sound in sort of Brookhaven around there. So what they're doing is instead of using nails to secure drawer bottoms in different places, they'll use wooden trunnels. And that seems to be something that is showing up in some of these Dutch zones. The one thing that I've seen different drawer construction-wise is the sides are dovetailed to the front, and then the back is dovetailed to the sides. So the Anglo version is usually to just have the keys all evident from both sides. So you're dovetailing the sides to the front and the back. What this does is it allows you to, if you wanted to float a panel in the drawer bottom, you could actually slide that in and then slide the back in and then secure it. Yep.
You mentioned spoons being given as funeral gifts. Why? Was that the custom? Is there a reason?
I don't know what the tradition, I just know a lot of the spoons that have initials on for death dates in the same way that in Boston, for instance, you give rings to people who are pallbearers, but spoons seem to be given out in Dutch funerals. But I don't know what the origin is. And spoons, there's silver spoons, there are tinned brass spoons, there are pewter spoons. So what is it, brandy bowls, why having two-handled brandy bowls, which are about 7 inches in diameter, that also have associations for ceremonial kinds of purposes, oftentimes on marriage or birth. I haven't delved into that nearly enough. Anybody else? Thank you for giving up a beautiful day.